Alrighty. Hamida Kipi, Ruben Amakiab, Ga Maza Adidi Hemye, Bresha Oyatek, Isanti Hematahan. How's it going, everyone? Anin, Buju. So I'm a very proud Dako Jibwe. I introduced myself to you all in Dakota, but I'm giving the land acknowledgement for our meeting tonight. So I welcome you all to this land that we all cherish and live upon. Mani Shota Makoche, the land that reflects the sky. Yeah, so we've made lots of so we've been here for 10,000 years, and made relatives with the Ojibwe here for probably a couple as well. So yeah, I humbly just say acknowledge this land that we are all on. Hichito.
Thank you, Ruben. Hamadaki, Chante WASHMN, choose everybody. Campbell. I am Dakota from Prairie Island, and I also have descendancy from Fond du Lac, Ojibwe. I am the current MIEA secretary, and I just want to welcome everybody here today and thank everybody for joining us. We welcome you to this important webinar, Understanding Indian Education Fall Legislature and its potential impact for all. Advocates unite to establish and maintain Indians.
Hey,
This
Tori.
informational position.
Tori, can I interrupt you just for a sec because you're breaking up really bad?
Oh no, shoot. I'm gonna relocate.
This is where if I was running this event, you all would get some jokes, some bad dad jokes, but I'll spare this crew.
Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm in my bedroom and it's a mess, so I'm gonna just keep reading. Okay. This informational webinar will review and discuss a variety of Native-related provisions in the legislature pending before the conference committee that can go a long way to improving the visibility, experience, and academic achievement of Native students. The purpose of providing these events align with our mission, that the association shall establish and maintain communications and the promotions of quality education and unity for Native people for express purpose of continuity of communications and ongoing awareness of local and statewide educational activities. Another purpose of MIEA is to support legislation that would improve American Indian education and promote leadership qualities among American Indian students and American Indian people to tribal governments and federal, state, and local governments. Without the ability to meet and greet you all safely in person, we've created this series. It will become a part of our library of resources as well, so you can access it whenever necessary. If there are topics or speakers you'd like to hear from in the future, please let us know. The email for that is info@minnesotaindianeducation.org. And we want to say, Nina Wopida, thank you to the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community and the Understand Native Minnesota for sponsoring this event and our work to support Indian education in Minnesota.
Thank you, Tori. Hami tapiapi. Petu kinde owasi. Chante washte anapechu zapie. Ramona Kito Stately, Amakiapie, Damakota. Good evening, my relatives. I am Ramona Kito Stately. I am Dakota. I am from Santee. My people currently live in exile from our homeland here, Minnesota, Makoche. I am the project director of We Are Still Here, Minnesota. We are a special project of the Native Governance Center whose mission is to spotlight and make visible the lives and contributions of Native peoples and their governance, governments in Minnesota today because we are still here. We will do this by challenging and correcting false narratives, replacing fiction with facts in K-12 education, and finding solutions for issues impacting the Native American community. We will braid together these strengths of established networks of Native American people and organizations focusing on governance and policy, K-12 education, pop culture and media, and philanthropy. So tonight is a great example of us bringing together and networking all of our strengths to for a very important purpose. So next, we're gonna play a short video to kind of ground ourselves in understanding the discussion tonight. And the name of this video is Reclaiming Native Truth.
Reclaiming Native Truth was an unprecedented national research effort. Never before has there been such a sizable investment by philanthropy in this type of research, and certainly in terms of its investment in Native Americans.
So we knew from the beginning that we were going to be doing something that hadn't been done before. It's our belief that the work that we do this year and in the next year going forward will really create a foundation of information and data the Indian country can utilize.
Data collection for the research project included focus groups, in-depth interviews with political, judicial, civil rights, business, and entertainment leaders. The project also looked at nearly 5 million social media posts from Twitter, Facebook, and blogs. More than 2,000 people responded to a national survey testing new narrative and message strategies. In addition, the project conducted 3 national surveys on the key issues and perceptions of Native America.
What we learned from the Reclaiming Native Truth research is that I think it affirmed many assumptions that Native Americans had. And that's that there are deep-rooted biases and toxic assumptions that many Americans across the United States hold.
Many Americans, including those in key institutions such as courts, philanthropy, and Congress, hold a number of biases about Native Americans. And many of these beliefs are learned in grades K through 12. The most toxic is the sense that Native Americans are growing rich from welfare and casino dollars. The study found only 36% of Americans polled believe Native Americans face discrimination. This indicates the level of discrimination against Native Americans is underestimated compared to other groups. The invisibility of Native peoples in everyday life, media, popular culture, K through 12, education, and institutions is extremely damaging and contributes to bias, discrimination, and institutional racism. In addition, these biased narratives set by others also impact policy towards Native Americans. The majority of Americans know very little about Native Americans or know any Native peoples at all.
What I found really interesting today is that 40% of people still believe that Native Americans don't exist. The real problem is when young Indian people consume media made by non-Indians and then measure themselves against it. And so it is problematic in our own communities if our children don't have the opportunity to see themselves authentically from an Indigenous perspective.
The project has yielded some very promising pathways forward. 72% of Americans believe it is necessary to make significant changes to school curriculum on Native American history and culture. 64% of those surveyed, even among conservatives, supported increased resources to reduce poverty, add improved healthcare and education. We also learned that new, more accurate narratives about Native Americans work. The Native Truth Project tested messages on a number of Native issues, including tribal sovereignty, education, and the Indian Child Welfare Act. The messages highlighted values, accurate history, and the visibility and accomplishments of Native Americans today. More than half are willing to share the new messages.
In our research, we identified 3 groups. We identified allies, we identified movables, and we identified a 3rd group that's going to be more challenging for us to move.
This research has been a ton of aha moments. Why this project was really important is because most of us in our professional careers are working on dissuading those myths and had no idea what that core narrative that people held of Indians was. And so we were always treating the symptoms and not the disease.
One of the most important things for us to accomplish is to be able to make sure that policy decision makers actually understand who we are at the core of our souls, our culture, our spirituality, our contributions. And they haven't learned that in the education system, but they can learn it by us. And I'm excited about using this data. When we think about the work that we do at NCAI, we do a lot of great policy work, but what we do not very well is sharing what we do and sharing the message. This data is going to help us share that message in a way that people can find our work more useful.
So I think this project really kind of gives us that kind of shared opportunity that we can work with advocates and allies and others who are interested in social justice and in equity. And we can all come together so that we can have a better way of life, socially and economically, while still retaining our identities. I think that's what this project helps do.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the way that I think about this is that we build awareness about invisibility. We build awareness if we can get mainstream society talking about the way in which invisibility of Native people is the modern form of racism, step number one accomplished. Number two, if we can get people to take seriously the fact that they are not getting a good education about Native people and to be upset about that, right? To start seeking out more information.
We are so early on in the process of what we understand. And we've learned a lot in 18 months, but there's still a great deal we don't know. And what's exciting to me is the investigation and the research that happens as a result of this and carries on and adds nuance to this. This is where it gets exciting, that we're starting to build a body of research and a knowledge base around this that we didn't have before. And that's why it's important that this work carries on beyond this first phase of the project.
And this next phase is about taking action, and it's about taking action with a clear focus on 5 key targets. We think we can impact change: popular culture, media, K-12 education, policy, and philanthropy. And so really it's vitally important that this next phase happen, because this is really where the rubber meets the road, right? This is where the opportunity lies for organizations and activists and tribal leaders and different types of institutions to actually take this data and to take the learning and the strategies developed, make change happen.
Phase 2 of this project of many movements. More truthful, accurate, shared narrative.
We invite potential allies, supporters, and others to join us in doing their part to shift the narrative, to help us remove bias and barriers, and achieve our collective vision for the change we want to make to improve the lives of all Native peoples.
Thank you, Ethan. So what's exciting is that we finally have this national research and data. So as you can see from watching that video, the invisibility of Native peoples today may represent our very biggest obstacle. This is cultivated in K-12 school curriculum, and it's an area in which many Native and non-Native stakeholders desire and demand change and progress. Only 47% of people in this RNT survey believed that what they were taught about schools in Native America in K-12 was accurate. This number was higher among millennials who may have experienced a more inclusive curriculum, but 72% majority believed it is necessary to make significant changes to school curricula on history and culture. Native Americans today are still here. Despite the history of oppression, we continue to grow, reclaim, and remember our cultural lifeways and values within distinct cultures. Our narrative and history must be told by us, not interpreted by a colonialist set of people and value, which is how it happens today. One of the largest perpetrators of reinforcing false narratives occurs in the K-12 system. So this becomes the basis of all children's foundations of knowing people different from themselves. We are committed to giving teachers the tools to share an authentic narrative of the 11 tribal nations of Minnesota and exemplifying our success and resiliency despite great barriers. So tonight I want to say thank you. Pida Mayaye, you make me grateful that you've taken some time tonight to learn more, to spend some time with us this evening. The passage of this legislation will improve the lives of the next generation by breaking the cycle of ignorance for the people of Minnesota. This policy will ensure that Minnesotans will have a better understanding of the lived experience of Minnesota's first and still here inhabitants, and help eliminate current disparities in the educational system by increasing the knowledge of future generations of Minnesotans. So next, I want to introduce you to our panel of champions. I'm going to introduce you to all five. And I want to remind you that in the chat, you can put your questions. We're going to have time after each speaker for you to ask questions, and then also at the end, because I believe the learning happens through the questions. So first of all, I'd like to introduce to you Wayne Ducheneaux II. He's an enrolled citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, a native nation that shares geography with the state of South Dakota. He served as executive director of the Native Governance Center since the organization's founding in 2016. Prior to working at NGC, Wayne worked with the Native Nation, for his Native Nation in several capacities. In 2008, he was hired as general manager of the Cheyenne River Motel, a Cheyenne River Sioux tribal enterprise. He went on to become the administrative officer for his nation's government, overseeing the Cheyenne Sioux tribe's day-to-day operations from 2010 until 2012. In 2012, he was elected by Cheyenne River Sioux tribal citizens from District 4 to serve as tribal council representative for a 4-year term. He has also spent 2 years as his nation's vice chairman from 2012 to 2014. So welcome, Wayne, tonight. I also want to introduce Brook LaFloe. This girl is on fire. That's what I have to say about Miss Brook LaFloe. It's my honor to introduce her tonight. She is Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, grew up in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, and is an educator and entrepreneur with passion for teaching, revitalizing culture, and facilitating the growth of local indigenous economies. Brook was born into the Eagle Clan and descends from the Bear Clan. Her academic background includes a Tulane University Bachelor of Science in Neuroscience and Anthropology, a Loyola University of Maryland Masters in Education, and 2 Association Montessori International diplomas in assistance to infancy, birth to 3 years, and primary 3 to 6 years. Brook has 5 years of experience in educational material making and many years in beadwork and sewing. Brook serves as the Twin Cities Metro representative on the Tribal Nations Education Committee, the vice president of People for PSEO, and is an appointed member of the Minnesota Department of Health Community Solutions Advisory Council. LaFloe spends her weekends as a youth worker at Andai Young Youth Shelter and is currently finishing her full-time Finovation Fellowship, building out her collective social enterprise. She enjoys fancy dancing at powwows, being a sister and auntie, and enjoying anything sports related. Our next speaker will be Benjamin Yawakie, who's also on fire. Sorry, Wayne, I didn't say that about you, but these young people are amazing. Benjamin Yawakie is a citizen of the Pueblo of Zuni and a descendant from Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, Fort Peck Sioux, and Assiniboine and White Bear First Nations. Benjamin is graduating from Humphrey School of Public Affairs with a Master of Public Policy this month, and from the University of Minnesota School of Public Health with a Master of Public Health in January. Wow. He has used his positionality in higher academia to advocate for increased curriculum regarding tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. In this advocacy, Humphrey now offers principles of tribal sovereignty and tribal state relations courses. Benjamin also works with Tad Johnson, the Senior Director of American Indian Tribal Relations at the University of Minnesota, to advocate for restorative transformation in the way that the university operates with the 11 tribal nations of Minnesota. He also advocates for the tribal concerns as a citizen member of Minnesota's Environmental Quality Board. More recently, Benjamin has also been chosen as a Udall Scholar and will be working with the Intergovernmental Affairs Office of the Department of Health and Human Services this summer. So I wanted to just articulate all of the education and all of the knowledge and experts that have come here tonight to help us get a grasp and understanding of this legislation and why it's so important for us tonight. Our next special guest is Dr. Jane Harstad. Many of us know her as the Director of Indian Education at the Minnesota Department of Education. Dr. Jane serves as the agency's chief liaison and working with the 11 Minnesota tribes, tribal nations, and Twin Cities American Indian communities. And one thing you know about Jane is if you reach out to Jane for help or questions, she is always right there. And finally, Chris Georgikas, he is the president and CEO of Goff Public. He is a renowned public affairs strategist and communications expert. For more than 35 years, his career has spanned national and state politics, philanthropy, crisis management, government, media, and business. So I want to welcome all of our panelists and experts this evening, and we'll get started with Wayne tonight.
Thank you, Ramona. How may talk you? Hello, my relatives. Greet you all with a good heart and a handshake. My name is Wayne Ducheneaux. One of the things that was left out of my bio, I wrote my bio, so it's my fault. But one of the things I'm most proud of is I'm husband to Megan and father to Veda, Aiden, and Alexander. So I got 3 little squirts, all under the age of 6. So bear with me if I look extra tired today. I have Zoom on full touch-up mode, and I'm still seeing bags under my eyes. So yeah, my bad. I get the distinct honor and pleasure to talk with you all tonight about the provisions that are going through the state legislature. I'll do a really high-level overview. I tend to talk fast when I get excited about things, and I'm really excited about some of these provisions that are in there. So if folks want to just be like, hey, slow down or be quiet, you're over time, please do that too. We are still here in Minnesota. The Special Project Native Governance Center has met with our task force, and we are doing full-out advocacy to support Indigenous education for all acts that are going through the state legislature. We've partnered with the great folks, Chris Georgikas and his team at Goff Public, who are helping to coordinate and initiate our advocacy efforts. And I'm really proud of the work that Ramona and the team has done so far. And as part of the provisions that we are prioritizing and supporting, the first one is the Indigenous Education Act for All. It's $1.32 million over the biennium to embed Indigenous education standards and required instruction and help with the development of curriculum. The second priority area that we're going to really advocate hard for are the tribal relations training for school leaders. This is a $250,000 annual commitment to create a new program modeled after the state tribal relations training. I think Ramona had mentioned that Ben is working for Tad Johnson in one of Tad's many capacities with the University of Minnesota. He helps to guide the state tribal relations training for state employees. It's a fantastic training. I don't know if anybody on the call or on the Zoom today has had the opportunity to take it, but it covers federal Indian law, history of Minnesota tribal nations in like a 1.5 or 2 day presentation. Pre-pandemic, they would host it on one of the 11 reservations within the nation or within the state. And they would put state workers with their tribal counterparts to really help bridge those gaps and to have folks understand that, hey, the state of Minnesota has a Department of Tribal Transportation. So do these tribes. Tribes have roads departments, transportation departments. And so when you put people on a playing field where they can see eye to eye with each other and understand the inner workings and learn about each other, it really helps to bridge gaps and to bring forth new possibilities. One of the reasons the tribal state relations training got started was because there was such a confounding time when state projects were happening on reservations. No one knew who had authority to do what, when, why, or where. And this training now is, I believe, trained well over 3,000 state employees. And it's really a good training because now we're starting to see systems and processes improve between the state and the tribal nations to get things done. Some of the other great initiatives going through the legislation include the American Indian Education Aid extended to joint powers. This is $167,000 over the biennium, providing American Indian Education Aid to schools established under a joint powers agreement. And sorry, y'all, I'm definitely reading this stuff because policy, state policy is not my expertise, and I want to make sure I don't mess anything up or miss anything. Another great initiative is data analytics for the state count of American Indian students. This is a $1.32 million initiative to fund staff and infrastructure required to report the state count so that AIS students are more accurately reflected in Minnesota Department of Education reports. Like Ramona mentioned earlier, one of the largest issues facing our tribal citizens, our Native peoples, is invisibility. And so often we show up absent in any type of statistics where you all remember the big meme from last year, right? We're something else, right? Too often we're considered something else and we're not accurately counted and represented. And it's no wonder we have the prevalence of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. It's no wonder we're not counted correctly in the United States Census. So this initiative will go a long way to help with data analytics to really support our tribal education programs. There's a $3.3 million tribal early learning package. And this is a grant to tribal nations to focus specifically on early childhood family engagement, education programs, and outreach. I'm doing time check. I got about 5 minutes left. Is that right, Ramona? And I'm rolling fast. See, okay. And so those are all the budget, the things that are going to add money to the budget. Some of those provisions, are going to end up bargaining chips as this bill is going through conference and being negotiated. There's a lot of potential that some of these are going to get passed. There is some potential that some of them aren't going to be passed. And so it's really going to be interesting later when we get to hear from folks like Chris, who have the ins and out, or Dr. Harstead, who have the ins and out on some of the opportunities that's going to come. Some of the proposals that revise current budget allocations or don't cost any money, I'm going to roll through these really quick, include clarifying the intended recipients for American Indian Education Aid. So this is going to clarify that aid may be used for, who aid can be used for under section 124D.74, subdivision 1. The Minnesota Indian Teacher Training Program, MITP, is that what we say, MITP, that's the acronym. Eligible expenses expanded. This is going to allow scholarship funds to cover expected family contribution. There's going to be tribal Head Start allocation set aside. So this is going to set aside 10.72% of the total Head Start annual allocation for tribal Head Start programs. And then tribal nations consulted on revising academic standards is going to become a requirement. So it's going to codify that tribal nations must be consulted during academic standards processes. And then finally, a few more to roll through. Man, everyone got this advocacy package, right, Ramona? Or they will after the end of this? Yes, no, maybe.
I think so. I think everyone did, and it's funny. I was just looking to put it into the chat. So
cool.
Can have it.
Yeah, I'm gonna go a little bit quicker through this because y'all can read up on it. I really want to engender time, make sure we have time for questions and answers. But so some of these final ones include a prohibition against American Indian mascots. It'll change and prohibit any schools in Minnesota from having a mascot that depicts or refers to American Indians without tribal consultation. There'll be changes and clarifications to the definition of American Indian student, used to establish an American Indian Parent Advisory Council, so an APAC. There also will be a change that adds language requiring that parents of American Indian children make up the majority of APACs. So that's some stuff that's working through legislation. There's going to be a change in regard to the Director of American Indian Education. These changes are going to make various changes to statutory definition of the Director of American Indian Education. It's going to eliminate supplemental from the American Indian instruction statutes, which is a good thing. Objects of cultural significance at graduation. This provision will change and protect American Indian students' rights to wear tribal regalia or objects of cultural significance, such as eagle feathers at graduation ceremonies. You all don't know how important that is to our tribal youth. Where I live in South Dakota, it's a scrape and a fight at many of our schools, especially border towns to reservations, where they don't want to allow things like regalia to be worn or feathers to be worn, or even have an honor song at graduation ceremonies. So the fact that you all are working on creating this as a part of law is very important work. There is some changes around the state count used to determine American Indian education aid. This change will codify a more accurate state count of American Indian students, and that must be used to formulate American Indian education aid. Teachers of color and Indigenous teachers report on a statewide goal. This will set statewide goals for increasing the percentage of teachers of color and American Indian teachers at least 2 percentage points per year. I think that's a huge goal to reach for. There's going to be technical assistance for annual reports. So it's going to change Minnesota Department of Education requirements, providing technical assistance, including providing an annual report of American Indian student data using the state count of AIS, American Indian students. And the last thing I'll talk about is tribal nation access to student data. This change is going to add tribal nations to the list of entities that use and may access educational data for purposes which are to be shared. So it states tribal nations will be able to then access data to the extent necessary to support the educational attainment of their students in question. So that really reflects the value that, no one knows better how to take care of our tribal youth than our tribal nations themselves. And so making sure tribes have this important access to this data so they understand where the students are at all times, it's really going to be beneficial as tribal nations go forth and advocate for increasing educational opportunities for their tribal citizens. That runs me through the provisions that I was going to cover as far as the legislation goes. I know we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end, but I'll pause now for a few minutes if folks have a burning question. Will the graduation include beaded graduation caps also? I think that would be a part, Roxanne asked that question. I think that would be a part of the native regalia. If it becomes statute, to allow for beaded graduation accoutrements on caps and whatnot. Great question.
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker, Brook LaFloe, the Tribal Nations Education Committee member.
Thank you, Ramona. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen here. Bonjour, hold on, let me share first. Can you guys see this?
You can see there okay. You go.
Ramona, I can't hear anything, so.
Yeah, it looks good. Okay. Well, there's
make it full screen.
Hold on, there we go. I'm getting it. And we'll go from the beginning. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Bonjour, Gagamishing, Zibi Manidukwe, Indigenous, Mikanakwaji, Dunjaba, Makizin and Dunam. Hello, everyone. I was named after the bend in the river. My English name is Brook LaFloe. Ramona said I am from Turtle Mountain, but I grew up here in the Twin Cities for most of my life. And I am from the Eagle clan. I'm participating today as a member of TNEC, Tribal Nations Education Committee. So I'm gonna give you guys just a little bit of background about what the TNEC is. Our goal and vision is to strengthen, protect, and advance the overall education experience and opportunities for all tribal students, families, and communities of Minnesota. That includes all 11 tribes. Basically, the history behind the Tribal Nations Education Committee in 2007, the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe Education and Human Services Subcommittee determined there was a need for a statewide Indian Education Committee to advocate, right, to do this, to serve this mission, to advocate for American Indian students in all areas of education, from kindergarten through secondary school. So then, the Tribal Executive Committee at the time formally approved the establishment of the Tribal Nations Education Committee in 2007. So it's pretty significant because membership is determined and endorsed by our tribal governments in Minnesota here. So thus we operate on the foundations of self-determination and sovereignty. So it's tribes acting pretty much on behalf of our own students and our own needs. So yeah, I'd say all our meetings, we meet once a month. All of our meetings are public and open, with the exception of agenda items that are probably more confident. So all of our meeting dates, our meeting minutes, and our agenda request form can be found on TNECMN.com. So, you guys are welcome to follow the work of TNEC. As I mentioned, we're made up of all 11 tribes in Minnesota, right? So there's all of our emblems. I have all of our members listed right now. This is also on our website. It's public information. We are representatives of their tribes. And then there's what am I doing on TNEC, right? TNEC. There's a few other positions on TNEC. That would be there's two reps currently from the Twin Cities metro area, right? Because a lot of our students, I want to say, like, I don't know, Jane, you could correct me. There's 8,000 or so in Minneapolis and a little less than 1,000 maybe in St. Paul. But there's a lot of Native students in the public school system here. And then we have a representative from Greater Minnesota. And then we also have a representative from the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, who's our secretary right now. So again, all of these members on the Tribal Nations Education Committee are appointed by their tribal leaders. So Wayne went through a brief overview of our in-depth overview of all the Native provisions in the Omnibus Education Bill this year, right, that pertain to Native students. I'm kind of showing you a comparison of the role of the Tribal Nations Education Committee here on the left. We do things like curriculum review. We advocate on behalf of student achievement measures. Teacher training, and then two that aren't on here that we're also big advocates of is language revitalization efforts. And then TNEC also is in charge of anything having to do, any revisions having to do with the American Indian Education Act. We also get to be involved in that. So again, some of these provisions that Wayne talked about have a lot to do with what TNEC oversees in the state of Minnesota. Indigenous education for all, really, we would be looking at the development of the curriculum. And in that bill right now, it says that curriculum would need to be approved by tribes. And then so TNEC would end up being that body that would review the development of that curriculum that would come from this bill, right, if it were to be passed this year. So there's Tribal Nations consulting on revising academic standards. For student achievement, there was many examples that Wayne gave that would fall under the bucket of student achievement, right? There's the mascots, the objects of cultural significance at graduation, the tribal and Head Start packages. I would also argue that has a lot to do with language revitalization as well. There's a lot of that work going on in early childhood work. The data, right, has a lot to do with student achievement. He said why it's important that tribes have data on our students so that we can track them. And then teacher training, right? We also would oversee some of the teacher training. So this is kind of just a brief review of how all of these provisions kind of do have a lot to do with the work of the Tribal Nations Education Committee. And why it's important that we also advocate on behalf of a lot of these to get passed. I mean, so there's in the conference committee part where I believe there's House members and Senate members now coming to the table to negotiate on all these pieces, right? So for all of them to get passed would probably be like a miracle, and it would be a creator's blessing. But they're kind of at a point where they're negotiating now, and a lot of these will be up for grabs. And but there's some that we really want, right? Like Indigenous education for all. I'll talk a little bit about that. And so TNEC, again, I said we advocate on all levels, right? From early childhood all the way through secondary school. And that's kind of what Indigenous education for all, that bill would really require Indigenous education to be taught to all students, right? It would be a requirement, not just of Native students, but to all students. So does that go outside the scope of serving American Indian students? Absolutely, yes, that does. But this proposal is actually significant because it will still advance the overall education experience and opportunities for our students, right? For our tribal students, our families, and our communities, because currently we have a Eurocentric exclusive curriculum for the most part. American Indian students not only face challenges around representation, with their own identities, they're struggling with their own identities, especially here in the cities where assimilation is quite high, but they're also not seen by our peers either. You know, I was one of 5 Native students in 2000 at my public school here in St. Paul. And we're essentially erased and invisible in our own motherland, right? It's kind of messed up. So that's why Indigenous education for all is it's kind of radical, but it's a proposal to teach us to everybody, right? For all students. It's going to be a fundamental way for our children to finally be seen by their peers again, and for their peers to know them, to come to respect them. And yeah, so it will pretty much create a culture shift, right? When we have the next future generations of relatives coming to know each other better and to not acknowledge our existence and our contributions here in America. When America starts to understand that, we know that we're going to be able to create a culture change in our society, right? In dominant society anyways, that allows us to better coexist and to respect one another. And that's going to be better for all Minnesota students, right? So that's why we want to see a lot of these passed, but especially Indigenous education for all. So I will say thank you, Miigwech. I do have a few moments also for questions, and then before we pass it to the next presenter, Ben, and then I know that there's going to also be plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay, Ramona.
Thank you so much. I was doing what Wayne said earlier, counting. He said count to 7, right? Was it 7? So thank you. And thank you for including the language revitalization, because Ethan is our tech guy. He's also the executive director of the Dakota Language Society. So had you not brought up language revitalization as a really important component of this legislation, Ethan would have probably run out the door. So thank you. Our next speaker is Benjamin Yawakie. Welcome, Ben.
Miigwech, thank you, Ramona. Buju and Dinaway Maganadog, hello, my relatives. Chi Miigwech for inviting me to speak today with the other panelists here. My name is Ben Yawakie, and I'm a citizen of the Pueblo Zuni and a descendant of Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, Fort Peck, Assiniboine Sioux, and White Bear First Nations. I've been fortunate enough to work alongside some of our speakers in different ways, advocating for equitable change in the way that the state of Minnesota operates with respect to their government-to-government relationship responsibilities with the 11 tribal nations in Minnesota. With the bicameral nature of our state legislature, the DFL being in control of the House and the GOP being in control of the Senate, and the increasing presence and political clout of the people of color and Indigenous caucus, it's important that we keep pushing for the incorporation of Indigenous education for all into any education policy that comes before the governor to sign. As Peggy Flanagan mentioned, this is a move to get schools to tell an accurate history of Minnesota's Indigenous people. Since the mid-19th century, many Minnesotans have been given an education that largely leaves Native Americans out of the narrative, despite the fact that the Dakota, Anishinaabe, Northern Cheyenne, and Ho-Chunk history is intrinsically intertwined to the connection to this land. When I think about what We Are Still Here Minnesota represents, I think about how important it is that narrative change is incorporated in all facets of our life. With the work that was done by Illuminative in reclaiming Native truth, it has given us a template from which to build out our advocacy for change here in Minnesota. There's no greater way to achieve narrative change, in my opinion, than what the Indigenous Education for All proposed legislation seeks to do. By embedding Indigenous education into the curriculum of pre-K through 12th grade, the 11 tribal nations in Minnesota would have the opportunity to share their history and story with all of the citizens of Minnesota. Specifically, if some of you haven't seen the legislation, it states, the curriculum required for Indigenous education must be related to the Indigenous experience in Minnesota, and this includes tribal history, sovereignty, culture, treaty rights, government, socioeconomic experiences, contemporary issues, and current events. The proposed legislation goes on to state that the curriculum also must be historically accurate, tribally endorsed, culturally relevant, community-based, contemporary, and developmentally appropriate. And I think that's what Brook was mentioning with the work that TNEC would be able to do. By providing this knowledge, we are better preparing every student to become an engaged civic participant that recognizes what treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, and self-determination mean as they enter into the world as citizens, employees, and decision makers. This would also mean that we could educate all Minnesotans earlier to prevent unnecessary lawsuits and unnecessary barriers to different policy issues. Education can be used to prevent these unnecessary hindrances on tribal sovereignty and governance. For example, the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwa's lawsuit against the County of Mille Lacs, County Attorney, and County Sheriff regarding the dissolution of a police compact and subsequent law enforcement jurisdictional crisis at a time when opioids and COVID-19 have plagued the entire nation. The county continues to believe that the 1855 Treaty Reservation was terminated by Congress through subsequent treaties, statutes, and agreements with the Mille Lacs Band. The band believes that county law enforcement has undermined tribal policing, resulting in an influx in criminal activity. In another example, the Department of Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation's Advisory Board tabled a grant that would have been provided to the Fond du Lac Reservation because the board believed the Fond du Lac Band to be anti-mining. The grant is intended to replace an existing and non-compliant water system that has failed Environmental Protection Agency standards. And this would have been done with a new water source, new water tower, and new treatment plant. State Senator Tom Bach, a former DFL member, stated at the time, "I'm pretty uncomfortable with this request. I mean, I'd like to do something for this part of the taconite relief area because we don't get many requests, but I can't remember us ever doing a grant to a local unit of government that is publicly anti-mining." These examples show that grave consequences and real-life impacts of not having Minnesota citizens educated on Indigenous history in Minnesota and what that means. As a personal anecdote from my own life, while I was growing up in Brooklyn Park, a white neighbor once told my dad, "If you can't live by the white man's laws, move back to the reservation." These words have stuck with me throughout my lifetime as I've navigated a world where I was one of only a few Native students in the entire school and in my local community, similar to Brook's experience. As a product of Anoka Hennepin School District number 11 and Breck School, I have seen and experienced firsthand what it's like to have Native history relegated to a brief mention of the Trail of Tears, Sacagawea, and Navajo talkers. It's not enough to take Native students out of classrooms to give them the opportunity to be with their Native peers. Although I deeply appreciated the opportunity to be educated and to share space with my Native peers, this education did not extend to the entire student body. More recently, as was mentioned in my introduction, I successfully advocated for the establishment of the Principles of Tribal Sovereignty and the Tribal State Relations courses that are now offered at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. These classes had not been in existence since the creation of the Humphrey, but now it offers public policy practitioners with knowledge that they will be required to know when they go on to work for the federal, state, local governments, as well as other organizations and employers whose work affects tribal nations. In the year of 2019 alone, some information I just found online, the Tribal State Relations training offered through the Minnesota Department of Transportation provided 8,635 hours of training, trained 785 people, and included 27 state agencies. These people included commissioners, deputy commissioners, assistant commissioners, and all other agency employees whose work is likely to impact Minnesota tribal nations. If the state can offer this training program to lead decision makers, the benefits that would come from providing Indigenous education for all students in Minnesota would be felt far and wide. We as Native communities and people still deal with issues like where tribal members are harassed by non-natives when they're engaging in the practice of their usufructuary rights in hunting, fishing, and gathering. They're harassed with verbal and physical abuse, and it is because there's this lack of knowledge regarding what treaty rights really mean. I've heard in the past the describing of treaty rights as rights that were given to Euro-Americans in exchange for land, contrary to rights being given to Indigenous people in exchange for land. This provides a deep understanding of what treaties mean, not only to American Indians and Alaska Natives, but also what they mean for non-natives that live on the lands that were established for them through these treaties. Indigenous education for all has a chance of giving Minnesota's education system a transformational change with respect to the state's relations with the 11 tribal nations in Minnesota. And we cannot have honest reconciliation until we have a firm foundation of truth. And so if anyone has any questions, be happy to address any of them.
So I'm just wondering if our attendees are just being shy tonight. But thank you so much, Ben. All of you made some really good points. And in the advocacy guide that we send you, if you can look at all the list of things that have been compiled and that have been discussed, pick out those things that matter to you, you know, depending on the age of your children or depending on whether you are an ally that works in a community organization that doesn't know or understand sovereignty and what it looks like. There's one of the things that you've done tonight is just to come and be here, our attendees, and to learn a little bit more. But the conference committees who are coming together right now to decide what are the pieces of this legislation that they're going to allow or bring in or approve, and which ones they aren't, is really going to depend on how well we can advocate. So we've created a really easy to use guide. It gives you all the information. It gives a template letter. You can add your own personal experience. But what we really need is for our allies, our parent committees, to share this information, to send letters. And now is the time. Today is the time. Tomorrow and the next day are all really important dates for the Senate and the House to receive letters from everybody. So do we have any questions from our attendees? Okay, I have a question here for Benjamin. I'm curious how you feel on the Environmental Quality Board, Benjamin. Do you feel like your perspective and voice is valued and listened to? Have you seen positive change and growth and how non-Native folks treat you and your perspective?
I feel like that's evolved over time. I'm in my second, going on like in between second and third year in my term. And I would definitely say not initially, but through some work that I've done with community organizers and different organizations to levy some like power and persuasion against some of our staff and some of our other board members. It started to include and start engaging in conversations about what it would look like for the EQB to be working with tribes on this government to government relationship basis, because like the executive order 1924 doesn't include the EQB. It does include a lot of those executive departments that are, you know, their commissioners are on the board. But I feel like, you know, with as well as building some advocacy with other citizen members on the board who are allies, you know, they're not Native, but we're able to, ask certain questions that start getting some of the EQB staff provoked to start to address some of these issues. Because like when I think about like the history of like Line 3 PolyMed and the impacts that it has on our tribal communities, it seems like there's a lot more that could have, that could be done. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do in advocacy in that position.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Christy, for your question. The next question I think is probably for Jane Harstead. Dr. Harstead, how can a parent make an impact in a predominantly white colonized school district?
That's a really good question. And I would say, first of all, being on your American Indian Parent Advisory Committee is the first step in being able to have a say and advise the school district on what your American Indian student needs and how the district can address those needs. And, once you have a foothold in with a parent committee, you also have in the spring the availability to vote with your parent committee on whether the school district is doing a good job with Indian education program plans. And if not, then it's a way to tell the school board how they can address those issues. So it's a good start. And then once you start going to the MIEA conference, the NIEA conference, those kinds of things, you'll find more ways to advocate for your students and for other families in the district as well.
Thank you. I have another question here for Jane, I'm thinking, but anybody, Brooke, you might be able to help here too. So I'm a retired art teacher who is interested in the development of curriculum and would love to be a part of the discussion of ideas in the area of Indigenous education for all. I am not Native, but I am passionate that our curriculum needs to change. How can I be connected to the Native community to help with these important changes?
I will. Okay, I will say that the art standards just got revised, and the arts standards folks at MDE are just now starting a focus group on how they can provide resources to art teachers to include Indigenous art knowledge and ways of knowing into resources for teachers. So I do know that at the next TNEC meeting, we are meeting with the art standards folks from MDE. So I would suggest either reach out to myself or the Tribal Nations Education Committee to see how that work will be moving forward. You've actually asked that question at an excellent time because we're right at the beginning of figuring out how to get those resources into the hands of teachers. So another great question.
Thank you, Katie, for your question.
Ramona, there's another question in the Q&A. Do you see it?
No.
Rachel Crawford asks, she says, Hamatakipi. She has a question for Brooke. She loved hearing about TNEC and Rachel's interested in the process TNEC takes on curriculum development. How do you provide Indigenous education for all? And do you run into problems with non-Native Indigenous teachers not understanding the curriculum?
Yeah, Jane, feel free to jump in on this if you want as well. Okay, so I should say that TNEC doesn't actually develop the curriculum, but they're the body that oversees like I don't know if you want to say like the like the passing of the passing of inclusion, of making the curriculum inclusive, right? So as Jane just mentioned, those art standards are changing right now, right? So that body, they will come to TNEC and be they will propose their changes, and whatever curriculum they developed to be inclusive of Native people. And we will review that curriculum at that time and ask questions about it. Is it accurate? Is it historically accurate, tribally accurate? As far as, Ojibwe Dakota inclusion. So I guess I should say, we don't develop the curriculum ourselves, but TNEC is the body that oversees the passing of curriculum, Jane, if that's the best way to put it. And then for the second part of the question, I'm looking here, how do you provide Indigenous education for all? And do you run into problems with non-Native Indigenous teachers not teaching the curriculum? That is absolutely yes. Absolutely. There's tons of teachers, I would say far less that choose just to not do it, as there are teachers that are not confident in their abilities to do it and not knowing if they're doing it in a culturally appropriate way. So I would say that it's yes, and there's teachers not doing it, and then there's teachers not having confidence in their abilities to do it. Or they maybe don't feel like they have enough information with the curriculum they've been provided, right? And they're not experts of the culture themselves, so they don't know how to interpret that information for their students, right? So that's why those tribal curriculum trainings and develop are important, right, for them to go to, for non-Indigenous teachers to go through. So yeah, if you want to expand on that, Dave, go for it.
Sure. I would say that within the Indigenous Education for All legislation, proposed legislation, part of what we are doing, because MDE cannot write curriculum ourselves, we have dollars for competitive grants for curriculum writers and dollars for professional development for teachers, because we often hear teachers say exactly as Brooke was telling you, that I don't have enough information myself, I don't know how to teach this stuff, what if I say something wrong, what if I do something wrong? And so we want to make sure that educators have the information and the resources and the knowledge to be able to teach Indigenous knowledge in a way that is culturally respectful and responsive. So that is also included in the proposed legislation and has been there from the beginning. And so I think that's one of the important parts that we can share with legislators, is that this legislation moves a whole topic to a new level with resources and professional development, so that we can break that cycle of ignorance, as Ramona stated near the beginning. And that's where we need to start.
Yeah, and I'll add on that. I think that's one of the important parts of this legislation is, when in 2010, when there was a statute passed that said, you must include Ojibwe and Dakota in all disciplines, what we didn't realize was missing was how do teachers just do that? And so this provides teachers with tools, because they're the greatest people in the world. It provides them with authentic, accurate tools, but it also provides the school boards and the learning leaders of school districts training to be able to support teachers in doing that. So that's where I think a lot of that budget part comes from for that. But it is inclusive of all the things that I think we didn't think about in the 2010 legislation. We thought, wow, we've made it. But this will check a whole lot more boxes. That was a good question. Thank you. Everybody ready to go write letters then?
That was going to be my call to action. So we have 25 total attendees, including 16 attendees and 9 panelists. Like, I just challenge everyone here write one letter, and everyone here get 2 other people to write a letter. I think, like Ramona mentioned earlier, now is the exact time where we need to strongly advocate for the passage and the adoption of as many of these Indigenous Education Act or Indigenous Education for All policies, budget amendments, everything. Like, now is the time to do it. It's time to have our voices heard. And in the spirit of we are still here, to let folks know that, hey, we are still here. So, yeah.
Chris, would you like to make some comments? I saw you turned your screen on.
Yeah, Ramona, just to maybe elaborate on what Wayne said a moment ago, the advocacy guide that WASHMN and MIEA and TNEC have distributed is very important. The legislature is supposed to adjourn according to the Constitution next Monday. I think as a practical reality, it appears that this legislative session, like so many of its recent predecessors, is going to be headed for a special session. The differences between the governor, the House, and the Senate majorities are so significant that at least for some of us who have been around the Capitol for a very long time, we think it could take several weeks before a compromise is reached among all the major decision makers. I see that Senator Kunish, I think, is among the attendees, and she knows better than most that there's a lot of differences to be bridged, including in the education omnibus bill. But hearing from those who are on this webinar this evening and other allies and advocates is critically important. Senator Kunish valiantly tried to insert Indigenous Education for All and a number of other provisions in the Senate version of the omnibus education bill. I think that, and I've hung around the Capitol for 30 years and seen a lot of really ugly things sometimes said about Native peoples and about tribal governments. I think it is a mark of at least some progress that in the debate, both in the House and Senate floors, that we didn't see that, even as there were attempts made to either strip out in the House or to insert in the Senate bills various Native related provisions. The Senate majority has not embraced the governor's Due North education plan and the many Native provisions that are contained therein. But I'm actually hopeful, and Brook mentioned that it might take a miracle to see all these things adopted, but I believe in miracles, but miracles are more likely to happen through all of the individual voices of those who are on this webinar this evening, and lots of others who aren't able to join us this evening. State senators in the Republican majority need to hear from everyone. I think sharing personal stories, those of you who are educators and can talk about personal anecdotes of either successes or disappointments in terms of dealing with Native subject matter can be meaningful. And many legislators read these things. They're inundated with communications, but many of them read these communications, or at least have staff go through them, and they can be very powerful. It's also significant that there are a number of Republican state senators who represent tribal nations, and that's important. And I know that the TNEC representatives and their tribal leaders have a significant role to play in ultimately bringing these provisions into the final compromise. That compromise might not be reached until late June, but continuing to put pressure, being respectful, but being a strong advocate can make all the difference in the world. And the only other thing that I would just add, Wayne, is that I think it's important for the governor, who has been an outstanding champion, the governor and lieutenant governor, of course, outstanding champion of these provisions, but they need to hear from all of us as well. The governor has a lot of priorities. There are a lot of issues that he's being asked to be the ultimate champion on. I have worked very closely with governors over the last 30 plus years, and governors generally get their way on big consequential issues. The Governor Walz and his staff and the lieutenant governor, they need to be feeling the friendly pressure of everyone here so that Indigenous education for all and these other very important provisions remain at or near the top of their must-have list. Because the governor is going to be negotiating not just the big budget targets and major policy issues, but we saw 2 years ago that he, Speaker Hortman, and Senate Majority Leader Gazelka often had to mediate some fairly mid-sized issues as well. And I think the fate of Native provisions in the Education Omnibus Bill are ones that the governor has to be thinking about and making sure that we see some real progress this session. So send the emails, personalize them, put your personal anecdotes, and let's keep the pressure both on our friends and those whom we have to persuade.
Thank you, Chris. So now that I know Senator Mary Kunesh is on the line, would you like to make any comments this evening?
Is she able to as an attendee?
I'm wondering, Ethan, is she able to?
She might just have to furiously type.
She's our big cheerleader.
Yeah, I think I can allow her to speak. One moment.
There she is.
Mataki Ape, everybody. Yes, I am state representative, State Senator Mary Kunesh. I served 4 years in the House, and I'm a descendant of Standing Rock, and just retired from education after 25 years this past November. So all of those things that have been discussed here this evening, I'm very familiar with them, and I have done my best at the legislature in my 5-year tenure to champion all of those issues, because I know how important it is to our Native communities as well as to Minnesotans and to educators to understand the real true history and the contributions and that our communities have made over the years, the hundreds of years, also the historic trauma that our families have endured over this time. As an educator, I was a library media specialist at the elementary level as well as a middle school level in the Robbinsdale area. And I had, every year I had teachers coming to me asking me to help them understand curriculum. There's a whole section in the 6th grade social studies book that teachers really did not feel comfortable teaching because they didn't really understand the context and the emotional context of all of that. And so as we go forward, and hopefully one of these years, we will be able to pass all of these bills that were listed here today. But it's so important that we are educating school superintendents and school boards and really doing some intense education around professional development. And so as we go forward, I really look forward to the progress. I would love to work with any and all of you on these issues. But this is a really tough year at the state legislature. I sit on the education committee, and I sat on the education committee the 4 years in the House. And Native education issues are not a priority, I have to say. And just as somebody mentioned, they're often used as a bargaining chip or treated with disdain. I had a state representative who he himself is an enrolled tribal member. When I went to him to sign on to some bills I was carrying that were specific to our Native communities, his response was, why should we give them any more money? We already give them so much. And so unfortunately there's an attitude at our state capitol that, Indians are coming always with their hand out, and we're always giving them more and more and more. And when is enough going to be enough? But we know that the federal government and our state government have never fully funded not only our BIE schools, our Indian schools, but our Native communities as they should, as well as our general public school resources. And so I have to tell you, you do have allies at the state legislature. In the House, we have Representative Becker Finn, we have Representative Heather Keeler, who are also Native folks. We make up the Native caucus, the small caucus at the Capitol. But we are behind the scenes, and we are advocating, and we are trying to work these in. And a big part of my job, I feel, at the legislature is educating legislators around the struggles and the needs of our American Indian students and families. And unfortunately, there's always money connected to policy, unfortunately. And when we have a representative or a Republican majority in the Senate that just is not looking to spend a single dime on pretty much anything, I'm hopeful, and I'm so glad that all of these statutes are in the omnibus bill. And as the speaker said, we are sine die. We end our legislative session this coming Monday. We're sure to go into special sessions once a month now, coming up until we come up with a final agreement. But in the meantime, please do write those letters. Please do make phone calls to senators and representatives, and really do share those personal stories, because it takes just one really good catch to catch that fire. And hopefully, if not this year, we will continue to do this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Mary Kunesh. So, do we have any other questions?
There was one more that popped up. Roxanne asked, are we addressing the racism in the education system?
I would say the answer to that is we are always trying to address the racism in the education system through a variety of ways, whether that is advocating and empowering parent committees to advise school districts on what American Indian students need, whether that is having webinars with Indian education staff across the state, whether that is meeting with the Tribal Nations Education Committee to try to come up with other ideas or other ways that we can move forward in trying to fight this. But I do believe that Indigenous Education for All is one of those pieces of the legislation that will really move the needle on the implicit and explicit biases that exist not only in staff but administrations and school districts. And we do have a lot of allies out there who are doing a wonderful, awesome job. And we also, part of what we do is get those allies together to try to promote and strengthen Indian education in every single district in the state. It's continuing, it will continue. It's been 400 or 500 years of this, and it's not going to be undone overnight. But I think these legislative priorities moving forward are helpful towards combating that.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. Do we have any other comments before we have a few more minutes? Anybody have any burning questions? We've got a great panel to answer tonight.
It looks like there was a follow-up also from Roxanne. Jane, are we addressing racism to the powers that be in the Capitol? And maybe Mary can jump in on this one since she's in the Capitol too.
I'll start by quickly saying that for the tribal state relations training that we have now for state employees, that there is a movement to bring that same training to the legislature, so that they are all understanding the same things that the state employees are understanding after that tribal state relations training. So that's one way we're trying to do that.
And I would just add that I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago in the Minnesota House of Representatives, Speaker Hortman invited the leaders from all 11 tribes and TAG to come in for a full day of discussion around treaties and sovereignty. And I have to say, I really do believe it made a difference in the House of Representatives. It gave a little bit broader understanding and gave a little bit more context to the work that we Native legislators were trying to do. Unfortunately, that has not happened in the Senate, and I don't know that it would happen under the under a Republican majority, but we are always fighting back against racism, whether it's for our Native or our BIPOC community, in every way that we can. And one of them is always to ask questions around equity when we're discussing bills and putting forth legislation. I would say that the House is a little more progressive on it because of DFL majority, but there's not a day that we aren't trying to fight back that racist attitude and build more of a general understanding of the historic struggles of all of our BIPOC communities, because it's real. And as an educator myself, I saw it in so many different ways within our school system and within our communities. And those are the stories that I try to bring to the legislature, so that when we're discussing it, I can give, real, true examples of how our BIPOC communities have been left out of getting a really authentic, excellent education in Minnesota. And so, yes, we are fighting it as best we can. These kind of changes are so small and hardly measurable, but I think we are making progress, and we'll continue to do that.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank everybody who took the time this evening to learn more, to discuss all the different ways that all the Native related legislation will impact us, and tools to help you support and advocate. This is a really important time. I just can't stress that enough. So I'd like to say Wopida Pidamayaye to all of our panelists, and especially Senator Mary Kunesh, which was just a great, awesome surprise. but this is community, and this is how networking, looks when we bring all of these different groups to the table for one united purpose. So thank you to our expert panelists and MIEA for sponsoring this. This is my MIEA hat. We want to say thank you to everybody also for being here tonight. So if there's no other questions, you can find this recorded on our MIEA website. It will take a day or so before it posts up, but if you'd like to share it, it will be available for you there. And contacts are on the web advocacy guide. So, hey, Tori's back. All right, so thank you, everybody. If there are no more questions, have a great evening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for everything you do, Ramona.